Okay, well, welcome everybody to this session of YRBiz, and the topic today is changing consumer patterns. And we are excited to have David Coletto from Abacus Data joining us today. David is a York Region native, having grown up in Richmond Hill, and got his PhD from the University of Calgary, and founded his own company, Abacus, so he's got the entrepreneurial mindset. He's been doing work all across the country, tracking how people are feeling about shopping and where they're spending their money, how they're spending their money, and the perceptions of the pandemic. So information that's really useful to our businesses here in York Region as you align your business plans and business strategies to take into account these changing consumer patterns. So before we get started, I would like to just say a thank you to the region of York and all the chambers of commerce who are participating on this series. The purpose of the series is really to provide practical and timely advice and information to York Region businesses to help them back to a path of prosperity. And so from that perspective, the series is designed to be responsive. So we are asking if you have any topics or issues that you would really like to see the series address, send us a note or let us know, and we will absolutely gather the resources to address that. A few quick housekeeping information pieces. So the Q&A is open, as is the chat. So if you do have any questions for David, please send them there. His presentation will last the majority of the time, but we're going to break it up into 3 sections, and there'll be Q&A times after each of those sections. So lots of opportunity to ask questions and get clarifications. If you have registered to receive the recording, all participants will receive a link within 24 hours of this webinar. The link will include the access to the recorded version of this webinar, as well as a PDF copy of David's slides. So you can relax and enjoy the conversation and presentation. You don't have to take a lot of notes. You'll be getting a copy of those afterwards. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Charles Banfield at the Region, to say a few words of welcome. Charles?
Thank you, Karen, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Charles Banfield, and I'm the Manager of Strategic Economic Initiatives at the Regional Municipality of York. So on behalf of York Region, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. And today's event is the second in a series of webinars that are designed to provide a roadmap to post-COVID economic recovery and help business owners and operators across all sectors get back to business. As Karen has stated, the goal of this webinar series is to provide information and resources that will help businesses navigate the current economic environment and to make the necessary adjustments to their operations to enable them to thrive in a post-COVID economy. So today's event will explore changes in consumer perceptions and behavioral patterns, as well as how businesses can adapt their operational practices and marketing strategies for maximum benefit. So I wish to thank our partners, the Newmarket and the Vaughan Chambers of Commerce and the York Region Business Coalition, who continue to work with us in developing and delivering this webinar series. And a special thank you goes to Karen Dubois for organizing today's event. So thank you all for joining us today, and I'll hand it back to you, Karen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Charles. I did want to also add one thing to the housekeeping. Towards the end of the session, we will be putting up slides with the dates and the topics of the upcoming webinars, so you can get those into your calendars. We're really glad that you joined us today. So without further ado, I'd like to ask David if he'd like to take it from here.
Great, and thanks, Karen. Thanks, Charles, for the invite. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was, as Karen said, I grew up in Richmond Hill. Was actually just in the region over the long weekend, visiting my parents for the first time since the lockdown really started. So it was great to come home and be there. You know, for everyone on the call, you know, I don't know what businesses you're in, but you know, these last 21 weeks have not spared anybody in terms of disrupting, you know, big aspects of our lives and how we run our businesses and how our customers are thinking. And the work that I do at Abacus, we've got an office here in Ottawa. I'm based in Ottawa right now, but we've got an office in Toronto as well. And we spent a lot of the last number of months trying to get a handle about, what's happening and changing in the short term and what's likely going to be the long-term implications of the pandemic on how consumers are behaving, what their expectations are. And there's endless questions that I'm trying to answer, and it's not easy. But what I'm going to try to do here is give you some insight into how I see people reacting, how they've evolved over the last number of weeks, where we're likely going to go, and as a result, how consumer behavior is going to change, both in the consumer market, but I'll also touch on the workplace, because I think changes in the workplace, changes around what employees are going to be considering, whether you are an office-based business, whether you're a retail, food service, or hospitality sector. Those are big questions that I think are important. So what I'll do today, as Karen mentioned, I'll pause at 3 points throughout the presentation. You'll see there's a kind of slide that says key takeaways. At the end of that slide, we'll then open it up for questions, so you don't have to wait to the very end. But the 3 areas I really want to focus on today is giving you the baseline understanding of how the public, Canadians, and in particular those living in the GTA. I can't get too detailed into the York region because of our sample sizes, but I can speak to the Greater Toronto area, which I think is very similar in their views, and they do differentiate themselves from other parts of the country and how they're reacting to the pandemic and what are they thinking about going forward. I'll then transition into thinking about consumer behavior, what's changing, what are the drivers that consumers are considering, how do you as a business react and respond to it, both in your procedures and thinking about what the customer's thinking about and how do you market yourself. And then we'll talk about the workplace and end with a conversation about what we think is going to stick in terms of these changed behaviors going forward and what might return back to normal. That's the big question. And I'll help you, I think, bring some insight into those things. As a starting point, I think it's important to recognize that, the pandemic will likely have significant impacts on people's behavior going forward. If we completely ignore, which is hard to do, the deep short-term economic, social, and health implications of the pandemic, those are going to be lasting and have long-term consequences. But the big question is, if a year from now, let's imagine a really positive place where we have a vaccine and life returns back to normal, what types of behaviors are likely going to remain that have been formed over these last 21 weeks and beyond that wouldn't have been there otherwise if this pandemic didn't happen? And I think I fall into the camp that I believe a lot of the changes that we are going to see as a result of this pandemic are simply accelerations of trends that we were already seeing in the marketplace. Things like a shift towards a more digital first experience, more consumers, more customers making decisions online, actually doing the transaction online if they're in a retail or service setting, whether you are in financial services, hospitality, retail. More and more of your consumers were already moving in that direction. COVID is just going to accelerate that and make it almost universal now because we had no choice. This touchless need, this touchless experience has required it. In the workplace, which will also have an impact on the consumer market, is we're going to see a shift in how people work and perhaps more important, where they work. I'm at my office right now in downtown Ottawa, and we reopened our office for optional employees 2 weeks ago. And we're obviously a government town, a lot of government employees that are still working from home, but it's a ghost town in downtown. And so if you run a business that relies on foot traffic, that's going to be very hard to return if those people aren't coming back to work very quickly. And that flexible work arrangement, working more from home, has also accelerated the trend that we are much more homebodies. We've been formalized by being forced to be at home over the last number of weeks. And then as things have reopened, as I'll show you, most consumers are being very hesitant to return back to certain types of behaviors. And that means for the last number of months, we have been home-based, and more of our behaviors, more of the things that we are entertaining ourselves with, the way we work, the way we eat, the way we shop, is likely going to be more at home going forward. That was already a trend that we had seen. And so the big question then is, as a business, you're trying to figure out, what will the new normal be? Certainly you're trying to react now to the current context. I'll give you some insight into that. But also is what's the right bet to make as I start planning for the future, as I start to decide, do I need to invest more in an online or digital experience? Do I need to change the way my store, if you have a retail store, is laid out? Do I need to rethink how my customer is going to be making decisions and how competition is entering or exiting my world? And those are all things that I hope this data helps you understand. But I do want to start with the broad perspective, because I am one who strongly believes that to understand a consumer, you have to understand deeper than just what they want to buy and how much they want to spend for it and why they're buying it. You have to understand some of their deep-seated inspirations and fears. And there's no doubt that Canadians across the country, in the GTA and around Toronto, are deeply engaged still in this pandemic. We finished a national survey, interviewed 2,000 Canadians at the end of July, so just about over a week ago. And we asked Canadians at the time, overall, how worried, if at all, is the situation with the coronavirus or COVID-19 making you right now? And you can see nationally, 31% of Canadians say they are worried a lot or extremely worried about the pandemic. I'll show you the trend line. That's elevated than where it was just a few weeks ago. Another third say they're at least somewhat worried about it. Only a small number of people, 7% across the country, say they're not worried at all about this pandemic. So there's still a level of concern. And you can see that in the GTA, where you are, it's 9 points higher. So 40% of those living in the GTA say they're extremely worried or worried a lot. So that higher level of concern, the fact that, although York Region moved into phase 3 earlier than Peel or Toronto, it was slower than in other parts of the province. That is largely driven, I think, by certainly higher case numbers, but also higher concern. The key point here, this is the percentage of those saying they're worried or very worried about coronavirus over the last number of months. We've been tracking this almost weekly, every 2 weeks at the very most. And you can see that in mid-July, it spiked back up, 34% saying they're very worried or extremely worried about the pandemic. It's come down slightly, but it's still elevated. It's higher than it was for most of June. And this is a signal that we may be entering a new phase where this fear of a second spike, concerns around going back to school, around going back to work, around government transitioning away from its emergency aid, has people re-engaging and reconsidering the long-term implications of this. One of the measures we ask people is, are you, over the last week, getting more worried or less worried about the pandemic? And that red line is more worried, green line is less. And you can see that in April, they really came together. So in most of the early days of this, people were still ramping up. They were getting more worried over time. But you can see they came together, but in the last few waves of our research, the gap between more worried and less worried is starting to grow again. That's a signal that a growing number of consumers are increasingly getting concerned about the risk of the virus. And that is going to potentially have influence on the choices they're going to make that I'll get into in a little bit more detail. And one of those primary drivers is this broad-based fear. 2/3 of Canadians, almost 3 in 4 of those living in the Greater Toronto Area say they are really worried or somewhat worried about a second spike in infections. And that fear of a second spike, which when we look at the United States, we look at some countries in Europe and around the world, is happening, or we believe it to be happening. And in some parts of the country, there's starting to be an increase in cases. Here in Ottawa, there's not a spike, but a slight increase. That fear of having to go through this all again, of another lockdown, of the economic and social consequences of that, really has people worried. And for a large number of consumers, particularly those over the age of 50, that deep fear of getting the virus, or if you're younger and less vulnerable to the virus, passing the virus on to somebody you love is still the primary motivation in affecting or predicting why somebody's worried about this. And so that mindset that people are still defensive, they're still worried about, about the risk of this virus, means that the decisions they make, where and if they go to a restaurant again, do they venture in to Hillcrest Mall or Vaughan Mills, as an example, will be largely determined by the risk perception they have about getting this virus. And if we believe that it's going to take more than a year to get a vaccine, then that kind of behavior is going to consistent. We're going to see this kind of up and down on those views. The bad news is, we've been asking, do you think the worst is still to come or the worst is behind us? And this is a percentage of Canadians who say the worst is still to come. It's up again. Almost half of people still believe the worst is still to come. And so that is a really challenging number for the business community to deal with, because consumers are very defensive. And one of the outcomes that I think is important to think about, that I have been talking about and trying to explore in the research we do and talking to different businesses, is just because a consumer or an employee can do something, I can go to the mall now, I can go to a movie theater, I can go to a restaurant, doesn't mean I'm going to do it. And that gap between feeling comfortable doing it and actually doing it is what I think is so important for each business, whether you want your employees to safely come back to the office or to the workplace, whether you want consumers to come back and shop or do business with you, is closing that gap and making them feel comfortable and ultimately in control of their space. And I'll give you examples in the next section about that not working. Obviously, when we're talking about consumers having money to spend and feeling vulnerable to economic disruption and risk, is a big predictor of whether somebody's going to make a big purchase or not. And what we find is across the country, as well as in the Greater Toronto area, large numbers of Canadians are reporting that the pandemic has harmed their financial situation. 14% say a great deal. Another 29% say it's impacted them a moderate amount. And so you've got two basic Canadas, or two basic York regions, right? Those that have been severely or significantly affected by the pandemic. They've maybe been furloughed, or they've lost their job, or they've seen reduced hours, and so their incomes are down. And those that haven't been affected at all, maybe have had to work from home and it's caused disruption. But those two worlds are very important, in my view, from a marketing perspective, because as the next slide shows, while 4 out of 10 Canadians and about the same number in and around the Toronto area say they have less money than usual. This is the question: how much money do you have at the end of the month than you normally would? More people say they have less money than more money. And so that means there's less discretionary spending out there. But on the other hand, and I don't know about York Region, but in Ottawa, there's, it's been very hard for people. I don't have a pool, but if you have a pool or you want to put in a new pool this summer, it's been almost impossible finding people, because there's a sizable number of people who have more money than they normally would. They're not commuting as much. They're not spending on other discretionary spending. If you have children, you're not spending on childcare. And so there's this pocket of people who actually have a lot of money that they wouldn't normally have. And so figuring out how to tap into that, one of the interesting, if you own a restaurant, for example, there's lots of interesting case studies of restaurants in some parts of the US and in Canada, particularly premium, high-priced restaurants that are actually doing quite well because they've adapted their business. There's a market out there who aren't spending any money on entertainment, but they want to escape. They want the experience. And so being creative and thinking about how do you engage maybe your past customers in new ways is something that I encourage you all to think about, because while this has been severely impacting many people, there are others who actually have more money and are thinking about ways, and they can't travel, they won't travel, as I'll show you in a minute, and that's important. That being said, there's still a sense of vulnerability. So when we ask people how worried are you about your long-term financial concerns, this is the trend line over the last number of months. It's still elevated, higher than it normally would be. I'd suspect this is closer to 30% on normal times, so still 10 points higher. That's the sense of vulnerability that people are feeling. Uncertainty around, is there going to be a second spike? What happens when CERB and wage subsidies are eventually rolled back? Do we fall off a cliff? Does the market crash again? All of these questions have left many consumers, investors, and others really uncertain. And so that vulnerability, that sense of, is it a good time to buy? Is it a good time to spend money? As I'll show you in a moment, is what's lingering in people's minds. And so you can't really do anything about that. You need to react to it and constantly demonstrate value, demonstrate the purpose. What am I going to get out of it? What need or want is it going to fill? And communicating with your customers, marketing to them in that kind of environment is going to be very different, obviously, going forward in this world of uncertainty than what happened prior to the pandemic. So in this section, I think the three takeaways are: first, although we hopefully have moved past the worst of the actual pandemic itself, perceptions around it, fears around it seem to be rising. We do see rising concerns about a second spike, which is going to have, unfortunately, a negative effect on people's behavior in terms of spending and going out and doing more of the things that they wanted to do. And it's obvious, both in the economic data we've seen and in our survey research, that there's been broad and deep economic impacts that have actually divided, I think, the population and the market much more. So Karen, I'll stop here, and I'm happy to open it up to some questions if anybody has any at this moment.
Great, thanks, David. Really appreciate that. I know one of the questions we received is from, I think you can see it as well, it's from Brian, the President and CEO at the Vaughan Chamber of Commerce. And have you done any surveying about concerns about going back to school? He's saying that issue has the potential to impact so many businesses and their employees' plans moving forward.
Yeah, we have done some, and so some of my colleagues and other firms have looked at this. I would say the state of mind right now for most parents is one of hopeful, fear, which is a strange place to be, right? Is that they do want their kids to go back to school, even if they end up working from home and not going back into an office, for example. The distraction that children have caused. I'll show you that later in the presentation. But on the other hand, I don't have children, but I've got lots of friends who do, and their reactions mirror the research. And that is a really profound fear, uncertainty around how safe are these schools going to be, right? In Ontario, the government's announced a full go back to school, but there's still lots of questions. And every day I'm listening to the radio, hearing people, whether they're educators or today it was a custodian talking about how, they're not going to have enough resources to clean the classrooms. That's going to continue to raise doubt, right? And make people resistant to wanting to send their kids back. And I'm not certain that the province or any of the school boards have done enough to make parents really feel comfortable to do this. So I do suspect you are going to see some resistance. You're going to see maybe some parents dip, their kids' toes back in the water, send them back in. But the challenge is they can't really see what's going on. And that fear of not knowing, is my kid safe? Are they being exposed? How clean is the actual classroom and environment? Which means that they're going to probably side on the side of security, which is, if I can, I'm going to probably not send them to school. But we'll see. I think those first few days in September are going to be critical because there will be a lot of attention. And if school boards and individual schools don't have the resources or just don't have the capacity to do this right, it could move really quickly to closing down. And the other thing I think we don't know is, if we are about to enter into a second spike, does that happen before school, or is it caused by it? One or the other means that, I don't know how long a school year will last if we do see a spike. So I think that's a big question. And I know even in my own workplace, I've got a number of parents who, have been able to work from home. I'd like them to come back to the office, but they're also juggling parenting as well.
Right. So just to build off that, the trends and perceptions that you're watching over the course of this pandemic, how does that track perhaps, vis-a-vis what's happening in the States? Are Canadian consumers different? in our degree of concerns?
Not as much as we might assume. I think, my interpretation of what we're seeing in the US, take masks, for example, right? There was all this chatter in the US about so many Americans not wanting to wear a mask, that the US president was resistant, and that there was this streak of liberalism or libertarianism that I didn't want to wear a mask. I want freedom, I want liberty. Well, you actually look at the data, Americans are just as likely as Canadians to support a mandatory mask regulation, or are just as likely to be wearing that. In fact, there was one study that showed Americans at one time were more likely to do it. So you get these myths that come out. I think where we differentiate right now is just where our respective countries are in terms of controlling the virus. So there's a strong correlation between a rising number of cases and the fear that I'm going to get it, and certain behaviors changing. And so Canadians are in a much better place in terms of the virus, but we look at the US and are influenced by what's going on. And so, as I'll show you in a minute, by far, 8 out of 10 Canadians say we want governments to go slow at reopening. We don't want to rush this. And that from a policy perspective influences their behavior as consumers as well. And so I actually don't think there's a big difference between Canadians and Americans overall. Certainly there's a little bit of political tension in the States that we don't find here, in terms of Canadians seem much more united about just doing what we have to do. But their fears of this virus are the same, because just like in the US, more or less, we've been told for weeks that this is incredibly dangerous. And as more information comes out about perhaps long-term consequences, I just read a story about, heart damage due to the virus, that's going to add more concern and add additional layers in terms of, what people are worried about.
Okay, well, we don't have any more questions pending, so if you'd like to get started on the
keep
second
going.
section. Yeah.
So let's talk now about what the implications of this are from a consumer perspective, and how behavior in a post-COVID world, but also in a COVID world, because I don't think this virus is going away anytime soon, actually means. And I've got a number of examples or cases to talk about. The first one is this question: is now a good time to spend money? And it's for some never a great time to spend money, but there's better times than others, right? This is the question of consumer confidence. Do consumers think that that I can outlay, I can buy a car, this is a good time to sell my home or buy a new home, to buy a major appliance? These are all the kinds of things we often ask to get a sense of consumer confidence. And this is in the GTA. So this is not nationally, this is in the GTA. When we ask people, is it a good time or a bad time to buy a home among non-homeowners, to sell a home among homeowners, to do a home renovation, to buy a car, you can see that in almost every case here, far more people say it's a bad time to do these things than do a good time. There's some differences. We hear lots of home renovations happening. For some people, because they're spending all their time at home, they've learned how inadequate some aspects of their home actually is. And so they're going to make, upgrades, or put in a home office, or add some, workout equipment because they can't go to the gym anymore. Those kinds of things are happening. But for the most part, I see a consumer market that is still very skeptical and very resistant to spending large amounts of money. We see that in other data that shows people are saving a lot more money than they normally would, that the level of savings is actually increased. People are paying off debt. And that's not a great thing if you want to stimulate the economy and you want to get people back out there, right? So the difference with this recession than past recessions is not that capital or supply have dried up, it's that demand is drying up, not because even people don't have money, it's because a pandemic has artificially kept people at home. And so in some instances, they're spending quite a bit of money on some things, right? Spending on, we've seen on takeout and streaming and home entertainment. If you are Best Buy, you're probably okay right now because people are ordering new TVs and new appliances because they're spending all their time at home. Grocery stores have seen record sales because of people cooking at home more than they ever have. But for a lot of other types of businesses, I was at the big mall here in Ottawa 2 weeks ago, and it was dead, right? It was dead. people don't need to buy clothes. If you are in a clothing retailer that traditionally or typically targets working people who, need clothes for the office. And if I'm not going to the office, I'm not going to buy suits. I'm not going to buy ties and shirts as much as I normally would. And so you have to think about the patterns of behavior. And as you think about inventory and your product lines and how you're going to reach people, I think it's important to think about what they need. So big spending is not likely going to happen for most people, although some think it's a really good time. The housing market, as an example, hasn't really cooled. It's largely driven by supply, the lack of supply. I know even in the GTA, there was a story about the market being very strong. But it doesn't mean everybody's able to get into that. One of the things I've been most interested in, and we've done a number of studies in Ontario and with a number of organizations, is looking at the impacts of tourism and what I call mass entertainment. So mass entertainment is, requiring lots of people to get together, like a movie theater or a concert or a festival, or things that attract people to communities. People get them out of their homes, right? Create foot traffic. I think it also applies to mass retail. So like a mall or a large shopping center or a farmer's market as an example. And what we basically learned, and this was a survey we did in June for a number of regional tourism operators or destination marketing boards, is we looked at tourism. And this, if you haven't seen this picture, this came out of Berlin a few weeks ago. And it's a picture of a theater in Berlin that was, obviously changed to allow for social distancing at concerts or at events. And when I saw this photo, I was like, wow, right? Like that is a different world. This is a strange place we now live. In the same way when I saw, a baseball manager and an ump putting a mask on and standing 6 feet apart, arguing with each other at a baseball game. Those are those moments that we'll look back and say that was 2020. But think about for a moment, from a consumer's perspective, what this picture represents. And the fear, as I've already said, the fear of getting this virus still exists and will likely continue to exist, even well beyond we have a vaccine, because not everybody may take the vaccine or that vaccine may not be effective. That's the first factor. But the second factor is this the kind of experience I want to do, right? COVID has changed experiences, forcing us to wear masks walking around a retail store, forcing us to separate ourselves in events like this. These are the questions that we ask. And so when we look at questions of travel and tourism, this was a survey of 2,000 Ontarians that we did back in June. We're going to likely do another one this fall. But at the time, as people were thinking about their summer plans, thinking about summer vacation, you can see that only 6% said when it comes to returning to travel, they will jump back in. That signals a lot of hesitation. Most would maybe test the waters, and another half said they'll only really get back in very carefully. Why is that the case? Well, they don't really want to venture too far from home. This is the percentage of people who say they will be uncomfortable traveling to these kinds of locations in the next 6 months. So internationally, to the US, off limits to most travelers. And I'll say this survey was of people who already travel, right? These are travelers, they're used to it. Even going to another province, half said, I'm uncomfortable doing that within 6 months of this survey. So this points to an opportunity. Hyper-local tourism, right? Families and people who are stuck at home and don't have a lot to do, if you're in the business of being able to entertain people, invite them in, whether you're a restaurant or a venue or something, how do you engage consumers now who are getting increasingly bored and don't want to venture too far from home? The thing we learned is, we've done a lot of research. 2020, I'm calling the year of the road trip. 87% of people said they'd be comfortable taking a trip in their car, but look at the numbers compared to train or airplane, right? Very few people are ready to get back on a plane. It's also the year of the RV. Lots of research showing that more Canadians, more Ontarians than ever are open to going on an RV. Because why? And this is a critical point. These venues, these modes of transportation allow me as a consumer to control my space. I know who's in and out. I know where it's going. I know where it's been. And the others, and I can control who comes into my space. And that thinking, I think, is really important. What are travelers thinking? And I think these questions are the same things that consumers are thinking. At some point early on in the summer, there were still restrictions on what province I could go to, right? Will I have to self-isolate after I get back from a trip or after I get to a location? Can I distance myself from others safely? Am I going to be crowded in? How clear are communications? This is really important, right? One of the challenges that businesses face right now is you almost have to reteach your customers what the experience is going to be like. So if I regularly come to your restaurant before COVID, I would know what to expect. That's why I come all the time. I like your food. I like the hospitality. I know where I like to sit. And that familiarity creates loyalty. But in a new COVID world, I'm not quite, unless you tell me, unless it's clear, I don't know what to expect when I come back to your restaurant. Will I be able to sit in my usual place? How will the servers be dressed? Will I have to, be spaced out? Do I feel safe and comfortable? And so almost if you can, give a visual, whether it's a short video or photos, particularly if it's a space that you're inviting people to, that makes it clear what they expect, because you're going to almost have to reteach everybody again. And then the last piece is, how easy is it to get to home if I need to, particularly for travel and tourism. That's important. So that's why local, hyper-local, or even regional trips are going to be much more likely for the rest of the summer, and I think into the fall, and maybe even into next year as you think about next year's plans. So that's tourism. But what we've also seen is, as time has gone on, as this pandemic has gone on, you'd expect people perhaps to become more comfortable doing certain things that at some point they weren't comfortable. We're not seeing that, unfortunately. In fact, as time goes on, people's level of comfort going back to certain behaviors in short periods of time has actually gotten longer or worse. So I'll give you an example. We just finished a survey 2 weeks ago that we had done in April. And so we have data in July and data in April. And we asked people, when physical distancing restrictions are lifted, and because at the time not all, like Toronto was still in phase 2, so they couldn't do all of this, how soon will you feel comfortable enough doing the following? And you can see, going to a restaurant, within a few weeks, you've got almost 40% of consumers in the GTA saying they'd feel comfortable doing that. Staying in a hotel, it gets a little bit lower. But look at the bottom, going to the United States for a concert, going to a music festival, you're getting 81% saying it's going to take at least 6 months or maybe never again before I feel comfortable doing those things. And in all cases, except for hotel, we've seen an increase in those who say 6 months or more it's going to take me. Now, part of that is because in April, many people thought it wasn't going to take as long as it has to get out of this. But another part is, the longer this goes on, the more we feel vulnerable, the more we even know that we can put masks on, we can distance ourselves. And if we still get a spike, that tells us there's always a risk out there that people are going to feel uncomfortable. So the question is, how do you close the gap? How do you create comfort? And that's going to require a lot of communication, a lot of marketing in ways that you normally wouldn't market. Because in the pre-COVID world, if you wanted somebody to come to your store or your restaurant or your attraction, they really weren't thinking about the risk of their health. Now it's the primary driver. And so you need to not only deal with the fact that they're going to ask about, is it good value for my money? Am I going to have a fun time doing it? But you also have to get them to feel comfortable doing it. So getting them out of their home has never been more difficult than it is right now. I'll give you an example. I work with a number of food producers, manufacturers. Think of the Nestle's and Mars who make candy bars. Halloween is a huge moment for them in their business, and as many retailers will say. And we did a survey in July asking parents, and this goes to the question around schools too. It shows the resistance. Of those who let their children go trick-or-treating last year, 56%, more than half, say they are unlikely or certain not to allow them to do it this year, right? So say you had 1 million kids on the streets trick-or-treating last year. If this number holds, you'd likely only see about 500,000. So half of that market is disappearing. And if this gets out and homeowners who are the other side of this equation are not wanting kids coming to their front door, or they're going to rethink how they know half as many kids are going to come to their house this year. They're going to buy half as much candy or chips or whatever snacks they hand out. And so this is an example of how the pandemic is going to change something that we almost took for granted in a way going forward. Of those that bought snacks last year for Halloween, about 60, about 2/3 say they're certain or likely to do it again this year, but we find about 1/3 of that market is unlikely to, right? They're going to turn off the lights. They're not going to accept kids. That fear of the virus being spread by children, especially after they go back to school, will be high. And here's another example. So I just share this as an example of how this pandemic and fears about it are going to affect consumer behavior going forward. The last point I'll make about retail before we take a break for more questions is a shift to alternative retail. As I said at the start, we had seen big shifts. If you're a retailer, especially a small retailer, independent, you're competing overwhelmingly every day with Amazon and Walmart and those big retailers online. And one of the things we've seen in our research is, as an example on grocery, a significant shift towards delivery, towards Amazon being a supplier, and to the rise of home meal kit services. So if you've heard of like HelloFresh or Good Food, you get a box and they come with all the ingredients and instructions, and you can make your own from scratch meals pretty easily. It takes the shopping out of the work. These are just examples. This is the national numbers of these changes in behavior, right? So we couldn't go to a store. Imagine you are, like my mother. She's 65, lives in Richmond Hill, loves, would go to the store normally, lived a more, I would say, traditional life in terms of not relying on Amazon or online retailers for most of her stuff. But for a significant period of time, she could not go to a store, and most types of stores. And so she got used to buying her yarn for her crocheting or from an online store. Well, the fear for a bricks and mortars retailer is that my mother got used to doing that and realized, actually, I got more selection. It comes pretty quickly, and it's maybe as affordable as if I went into a store. That my mother's behavior has now been changed as a result of exposing her to a new form of behavior she wouldn't have never considered, but because of circumstances she did. And so we are seeing a shift to much more the acceleration of online retail. And so thinking about how do you create your own online retail if you're a retailer? How do you, if you're a restaurant, offer service and food to people who are at home? I know here in Ottawa, a number of the restaurants have been quite successful at creating their own meal kits and their own meal boxes. So people not just take out, but actually give me the ingredients, inspire me to make something that you would normally inspire, teach me how to do it. And it's a replacement. It's not a replacement for the full spend that person would make in your store, in your restaurant, but you're keeping them loyal, you're keeping them tied to the story, and you're able to at least predict how many people are going to want that going forward. That's an example. So for the consumer world, I think the takeaways are, despite being able to now return pretty much to almost everything we could do, although it's very different, comfort is slowly returning. It's slower to return than many people thought. I think the data points to a lot of resistance by most consumers to getting back out there and doing what they did. It just doesn't feel the same. The other thing we worry about is, for a long time, people may do without certain things. They found pleasure in going for a walk or going for a hike or watching, a new video or streaming service instead of going out to a bar or a pub or going to a movie theater or walking around a mall as a way to kill time. They've had to replace all of that. And so it forced us to change behaviors and perhaps form new habits that you now need to relearn and figure out, how does your business serve those people? I do think there'll be long-lasting impact to mass entertainment and tourism and possibly retail. Until people feel comfortable assembling in groups, the business model for many of these venues and types of entertainment are gone. And you're basically, therefore, taking the ancillary benefits, whether that's going out to eat. If you're a restaurant that might capture people going to theater or movie theaters prior to going, you now can't rely on that draw because people aren't going to that venue. And so that's going to have a big impact. Over to you, Karen, for some questions.
Great. Yeah, thanks. So David, we have one question about who are these individuals that you've surveyed and how are these groups targeted and contacted to gather the information? So
yeah.
I wonder if you could share a bit about your methodology.
Yeah, great question. I just sort of didn't even touch on that. So all of our surveys we do online, but what we do is we recruit from panels that have over 500,000 Canadians. And so we try to mimic what would be from a random sample, a representative sample of Canadians. So it matches the population by age, by gender, by education level, household income, region and language, and whether they were born or not in Canada. And so this is a really good snapshot. It's the same methodology we used during the last federal election. We were one of the most accurate polling companies in the country. And so it allows us to do it. For the GTA numbers that I shared, because it's such a large region in the country, we have at least 200 to 300 interviews in that region. So it gives us the ability to speak to the GTA in a way I couldn't speak about Ottawa or other parts of the country.
Great. Obviously a lot of concern about, the smaller retails, the businesses, the hospitality businesses, especially where we don't know how long they have to function at reduced capacity. And now we're layering on this concern, this risk, of customers not returning to their traditional habits. And so, do you see businesses going, through more challenging times ahead? What kinds of things are, opportunities perhaps?
Yeah, I do think they're, depending on what business you're in, those three I mentioned at the bottom of that slide right there, I think there'll be ongoing challenges. I just don't see, until there's a vaccine and it's widely injected into people, that this fear of this virus is going to subside. Right. And so that's a challenge. I mean, it doesn't mean contact tracing and some of the testing improves that reduces the risk, might make that better. And that's my hope. But I do think there'll be continued challenges. I mean, the opportunity here, for some businesses, it's incredibly challenging, and it will be. But I do think there's an instinct in people to want to support local businesses, right? Like the last thing I think any resident in Richmond Hill or Markham or Vaughan or Newmarket or Aurora wants is that their main streets completely die and disappear, right? And that's because communities need this. Community quality of life is dependent on the ability to go and shop and it's a form of entertainment as much as shopping and eating is needed. It's something we do. There's a great article in The Economist about restaurants, not really being about the food at all. It's about the experience. So the question in the meantime, the question I think I would, if I was in many of your shoes thinking about is, how do I replicate the experience people are seeking, the ability to escape, the ability to feel good, to be delighted, to get the things I need. Some of them are needs, some of them are wants, in a way that makes me feel comfortable. So if you are a retailer and you haven't, seriously looked at creating your own online store using like a service like Shopify or something like that, you should look into it, because not only does it allow you to connect with your existing customer base if you're able to do it, but it actually allows you to compete nationally or globally, right? It opens up your customer base. If you're a restaurant, I think there are opportunities. Certainly, I know that, delivery and home takeout, there's huge costs associated with it. But I think, competing in that environment is going to happen. You're going to have some people come back to restaurants, but because of restrictions on the numbers, certain restaurants aren't going to be viable, or, because you can only have 30 or 40% of your tables filled, you're going to have to look at other alternatives. I think there is opportunities. I don't know enough about individual businesses though to speak to specifics, but it's, your customers, and that's, I guess, the other piece of advice I'd give is, really think about what it is that drives your customers to come to you normally. And if it was just convenience, you're going to have to recreate the value proposition in a way, because the convenience has shifted away from you now, because you may have been on their path home or, you know, on the drive home from the office, but they're not driving to the office anymore. So how are you going to get them to come back? Think of McDonald's and breakfast.
Right.
You know, that's an example.
So I know we have a couple more questions that I just wanted to say that if we don't get a chance to answer all the questions on the session today, David has generously offered to answer them afterwards, and that we will send those answers out to all the participants. So I just wanted to give you that heads up. And I also just wanted to add something to what you said. I was speaking with a restaurant owner yesterday, in fact, and she was sharing about this transformation that's happening in the restaurant industry with the rise of ghost kitchens. So she needed new revenue sources, and basically ghost kitchens are somebody orders from a different restaurant located outside of the area, the order goes into her restaurant and she fulfills it locally. So I just thought that was a really interesting thing to keep in mind. And as much as you want a position to support the consumers, industries themselves may be transforming, and then those may be creating new opportunities, but in ways that we've just never experienced before.
Yeah, and I was thinking of, malls. I read one article about a mall that's going to install a shipping facility right in the mall, so that retailers, if they needed to ship because they had an online or e-commerce option, they could use the mall's facilities to mail, products to them. It's just this evolution was already going to happen, and it's just accelerated significantly.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well,
I'll continue on. Yeah. I know we've got about 10 minutes left, so.
Yeah.
The next question then is just quickly on the workplace. I do think that if anything we've talked about what sticks and not, changes in the workplace, I think are going to be real, and they're going to be long lasting, particularly office-based work, past the pandemic. Just as an example, when we asked people who were able to work from home in a survey, has this time been more productive or less productive or about the same than usual? And you can see people are pretty split across the country on this. And the big drivers of if you felt you were less productive were, well, if you were a woman, if you had kids, you were more likely to say less productive, because as a female, you probably took on more of the other responsibilities in the household and along more of the caregiving. And so, being at home and working and trying to do all of it meant you were less productive. But for a sizable other portion who didn't all have kids, or were younger in particular, and older, who had maybe kids leave the household already, there was an idea that I'm more productive. And I think this is even more true in the GTA, where commuting for hour on end. My sister lives in Richmond Hill and commutes into the city. She hates it. It's like the bane of her existence. She hasn't had to do it for 20 weeks. And so that productivity, that quality of life is going to change expectations. And so when we ask people who've worked from home after the pandemic, what would you like to do? We see about half of people saying, I want to either work at home full-time or work at home at least a few days a week. So lots of desire. And I think that desire would have likely been there before the pandemic, but this has just reinforced it, that I can work from home. It's much more preferable to that. The flip side is, well, a sizable number say, no, I want to go back to the office full-time, 1 out of 5. And 17% say, well, I'd love a flexible option. So I'll work mostly from the office, but every now and then I wouldn't mind working from home. And it's obviously going to be dependent on what employers seek to do. But if you think of York Region primarily, although I know it's changing and more businesses are actually opening their head offices and things in the region, that if it's becoming less of a commuter town and more of a place that people spend more of their time, that also creates new opportunities, right? At the detriment of downtown Toronto. So if all those people are not spending 40 hours a week downtown, but now spending 40 more hours a week closer to home, it creates new opportunities for businesses around lunchtime, around breakfast, particularly on the food service side, around people taking breaks and going out and maybe doing some shopping locally as opposed to, at the mall or at retailers in downtown Toronto. And so that's the upside of this, right? If you are a retailer or a food service or any kind of attraction, is that people will be closer at home. And so they'll be spending more of their money in York Region than they would if they were having to commute into the city or into other parts of the region. So that's one upside. the downside of all of this pandemic remains that there's a survey that came out from KPMG this week that said 64% of Ontarians are afraid of returning to the workplace. That's a lot still. And so that question that was asked about, parents sending their kids back to school, if they're afraid of going back to work, then they're also afraid of sending their kids back to school. And I know my workplace is challenged with it. My wife's is, how do you get people who have kids or fear coming back to the office or the workplace doing that? And that's going to be I think a serious strain on employer-employee relationships going forward, and finding a way to be both empathetic and understanding, but at the same time firm and, because you need your team to come back, will be a challenging thing. But to know that a lot of your employees are going to still be fearful of coming back, and so making sure they feel comfortable putting in procedures, making sure there's the protective equipment there, and pushing government to continue to provide that is important. I know somebody asked a question about, CERB and public support for those programs. I describe the current environment as, the government has basically induced us into a coma, right? There was a crisis in our body, and they put these CERB and wage subsidies in place to get us through the worst part of it. The challenge now is, and I don't know where it is what happens when you remove that, when we come out of the coma and our bodies are now reacting again. I do suspect that, the public generally supports government spending all the money they're spending. They feel vulnerable. But whether we can continue to do that sustainably is a whole other question. I want to end with one thought. And that's what I said is, what behaviors will stick post-COVID, right? So as you plan even farther out into the future, what can we expect? And McKinsey did an interesting study that looked at, different behaviors that have emerged now that will not likely stay, those that have accelerated, and those that weren't really here before, but that might stay in the future. And these are just examples, and they don't apply to all of your businesses, but they give you insight into where we're likely going and where we won't be going. So if you look at the blue box for now, these are things that people have overwhelmingly done because they've had to, but tell us they don't really love doing it, right? So think about all the video conferences you've been on, or video chats, where they've been okay. They've gotten us through. We can communicate with each other here. This is great. I'd much rather have done this in person with you in York Region. But if I don't have to, I'll probably throw them away or do less of them, right? I'll rather talk to you in person. Grocery delivery, another one. People say they've been doing it, but for a lot of people who buy groceries, the experience of actually touching the fruit, of seeing the products is a part of what they do, so they'll not likely continue to do that. Some will, but most won't. Curbside pickup, another kind of behavior that we've had to do now, but survey research is saying people wouldn't want. But on the other two, accelerated shifts that I've already spoken to, buying online or in-store pickup, those are not going away. Those were never going to go away. Those were only going to get more intense. And now more and more people, those that I call the digital immigrants who weren't used to using technology, have now used technology, and it's worked. And like my mom is one of them, and she's going to continue to buy her yarn, I think, online. So how do you enter that space, and how do you compete with the big, Amazons and the smaller ones in that space is a question. Online fitness, if you are a gym, whether it's buying a Peloton bike or using online fitness apps, that's something that people have overwhelmingly accelerated towards and are likely going to stay with. And I do some work with some professional sports teams here in Ottawa. The Red Blacks is a football team. We were, before COVID, doing some research trying to figure out how do you get people out of their homes and spend money under normal circumstances. We've likely seen an acceleration towards more home-based entertainment. So streaming, online games. We've seen a huge explosion in gaming over this pandemic. That's likely going to continue. And some of the new things, digital exercise machines. That's like those Pelotons that I talked about. Meal kit deliveries. So the Good Foods and HelloFreshes. More people going to continue to cook from home. I think once people return back to the workplace, once they feel more comfortable going back to restaurants, some will go back. But I think the challenge is that people have gotten used to cooking. Maybe they didn't know how to cook or they didn't like cooking and they've had to. That will likely continue and move forward. And fast food drive-through was very popular, and it's going to likely continue to be going forward. So the takeaways of all of this is I think workplaces will be forever changed. What consumers and workers are telling us right now is that that some of them like this new world, some of them don't, and that's going to just mean more flexibility and creating options for your employees, particularly if you're office-based. Changes to community planning and viability. These are huge implications of, where we work affects the economy in substantial ways, right? That you have these thousands of people congregating in these kind of poorly planned, if you think about it, it's so poorly planned to have all these people going to downtown Toronto all the time. That's not likely going to be that way. So if you are a business in downtown Toronto, it's bad, really bad, particularly if you're in commercial real estate. If you are in the suburbs, to more extent, that's going to, we're seeing this shift in people wanting to live farther away. If you're a smaller community in York Region, King, up towards, Keswick, you're going to probably have more demand to move out into those communities because you don't no longer have to commute as far into your workplace. So it's going to create new opportunities for some communities actually to see people move in. And the challenge for transit systems is significant. Lastly, I expect we're going to see more flexibility. So all this, just to wrap up, I know we're over time. I think the big takeaway I take of this is much still depends on how long this recession and the pandemic goes on for. The longer it goes on, the more behaviors are going to change, and the greater the risk and opportunity to take advantage or be hurt by those things. I come back to the point I made earlier. I really do think that the difference between being able to do something and feeling comfortable to do it is fundamental to re-engaging customers and closing that gap. And I think this data and all the data I've seen, and as a business owner myself, it's forced me to rethink how I approach my customers and my employees and throw out previous assumptions about how they behave. We have to, in a way, relearn and re-engage. And that starts with talking to your customers, learning from them, and finding out how to best serve them. So I'll stop there, Karen. I know I'm over. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Karen. Here's all my contact information. If there's any quick questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I'll get back to people after. Thanks, Karen.
Great. David, thank you so much. It was really interesting. And, because there's no precedent for this time that we're in, the type of information you're sharing is so crucial and thought-provoking. So thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise. I want to thank the region, Charles and Jennifer, for putting the series on, and Tracy Walter and Brian Schiffman from the Newmarket and Vaughan Chambers of Commerce, and all the other Chamber of Commerce leaders who are supporting this series. I just wanted to call your attention. So next week's section is also from 12 to 1 via Zoom, and we're going to be talking about how to configure your business space for safety. So we have workplace health and safety coming online, with also Studio Forma, that is a commercial interior designer. We'll be able to peek into some businesses that have already done that, and you'll walk away with some tips and tricks and easy to implement strategies that you can use in your business. And just a final reminder, we will be following up by email, sending out a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. In that follow-up, we'll also put a link to the recording from the previous session we did on how to implement the mandatory mask mandate. So thank you again, David, for being with us today, and thank you everybody for joining. I hope you have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.